I'm Lacey from Just One More Fix, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual host. Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
It's time to shove off and welcome you to episode number 150 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we duel over starting a podcast.
In this week's Better Podcasting Download, we talk about my first-hand experience with the Spotify Podcaster Portal.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we go over some very interesting tweets sent to @BetterPod.
Lauren, start the show now. It's 1:50. SP needs to sleep. He's been celebrating early.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 150 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is the man who's 150 years old, Stargate Pioneer.
That's not too far off, actually, and we won't even go into dog years, but hey, I just want to say thank you, listener, for staying with us. It's been 150 great episodes. We have had some great audience interaction. So thank you for making this show possible for 150 episodes. And one of the things that we do to make this show so successful is we have a little segment when we start off our show called How I Saved My Podcast. Now, this is a segment where if you have something that happens to your show, we want you to call it in, send us a voicemail, send us a video mail, or just send us an email or maybe even a tweet to tell us what you did to save your podcast, because we're all hobby podcasters. We've all had to do extraordinary things to get our podcasts out the door, and we want to hear from what you did so that we could share with the class and everybody can learn from everybody's mistakes. We've given our own quite a bit, Stephen, you and I, haven't we? I mean, we've saved our podcast quite a bit.
Never made a mistake in my life.
I guess my mistake is choosing you as a co-host and trying to be a little yes man in the improv, but I guess not. In the meantime, when we don't have a How I Saved My Podcast story, we reach into the interwebs and we find out how I could have saved my podcast story. In this particular case, we reached into Reddit and we have a post titled "Takes Forever to Warm Up Once We Hit Record." And the post reads, "My co-host and I don't feel like we're on until the second half of our recording sessions lately. It's a casual conversational podcast. We record remotely and usually spend about 30 minutes beforehand catching up and prepping for the episode, at which point things are flowing smoothly, but then we hit record, talk for a few minutes to find a cold open, and then things feel stiff. It feels like we spent the first half of the episode warming up. Does anybody have any advice for just turning it on?" Well, Stephen, I have a few things here, and one of the things is maybe you want to tell each other a few jokes or high energy stories from the day, or maybe you want to listen to some really funny or engaging videos or content. We actually used to do that back in the day on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. We'd all watch a funny video before we started recording. And another thing that you can do is just put some really cool, fun content right up front, like a How I Saved My Podcast story. Stephen, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you got to find that balance of fun, but also getting to your topic. And the people who have a little bit of something that's more engaging at the front, I think that opens them up. But from a production level, I actually have a tip that we often take for granted here with SP and I and shows on the Gonna Geek Network, because many of them are live streamed. And what that is it's the intro music. Now, why I'm saying that is because the thing what we have going for us when we're live is we try to produce the show. We try to produce the heck out of the show for the live viewer. So we have an intro in there and everything. Well, that's sort of a bit of our, let's call it warm-up music. And I've known podcasters before who, even when they haven't done live streams, have at least played a section of their intro just to get them in the groove. It's sort of a great way to open it up and make yourself feel the podcast, as opposed to being like, all right, we're off the show talking about our day. We're having fun as you and me. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I guess we better get this going. Let's record. And you're sort of supposed to be on command. But if you take a few seconds of that intro and play it back to yourselves, then it just keeps you moving and really gets you in that podcast mind. So I've known people who have done that and have been quite successful with that. I used to do that with Fanboy Buzz when I noticed that people were a little bit stiff and we weren't doing it live, and it definitely made a difference. So that's a little tip that I have.
All right. So if you actually have a tip for our fellow Redditor who wants to not take forever to warm up once we hit record, why don't you get it into us and we'll play it on a future episode. In the meantime, Stephen, you and I have a little business to attend to, a little match in the ring of how to start a podcast.
All right, 150 episodes of Better Podcasting. Now, that is a few episodes, so we've been told. Now, on our milestones, we do like to do certain episodes, like on our 50s. For example, we did on the 50th episode, SP's Golden Rules of Hobby Podcasting. In episode 100, we did Back to Basics, where we demoed a whole bunch of common mistakes. And so for those of you who have listened to this show for more than a minute, you've probably known that SP and I host things a little bit different with our podcast. That's right. SP uses media hosting through and through, while I self-host my podcast. So today we're going to the basics of both of these, and we're going to, for our 150th episode, compare the differences from a setup perspective between media hosting and self-hosting. Now, to be clear, I want to say on the record, go ahead, write down the time code right now, get ready, somehow take something that I said from a past episode and make me laugh in my own face, that on the record, I want to say that I believe there are many users who definitely should stick with media hosting, because I do think that it is a little simpler of a process. It's like my opinion on iPhone voice versus Android. I will go and throw iPhone shots all the time for fun, but there's many people that I recommend they stick with an iPhone for the same sort of reasons. So I just want to say that up front, although I'm talking about self-hosting your podcast, I do think that there are people who are best to stick away from it. So there you go. Now you can throw your eggs at somebody else or me, whatever. I'm used to it.
Do they have your permission to replay that audio back at any point in time, Stephen?
Sure. Go ahead and play it back. Well, I don't care. You can just say like, oh, yeah. He's even eating his own words. So go ahead. Do whatever you want.
Yeah, just credit Better Podcasting episode number 150, found at betterpodcasting.com. All right. So before we get into any of the actual differences, the techie stuff of setting up a podcast, we want to talk about the commonalities between both methods. And now this is the groundwork you're going to need before you can even go with either method. So the first one that we need to get out of the way is what we talked about in episode 1 of Better Podcasting. You need to choose a topic, a theme for your show. We won't go into all the details of this. Go to betterpodcasting.com/1. But the summary is you should be passionate about whatever topic or theme that you choose from your show. Now, Stephen, once you have the topic, what's next?
Well, you want to think of your podcast name. Now, the name should be unique, but also ideally talking about the subject matter. Hint, Better Podcasting. Hey, you know what it's about. For example, the Stephen Jondrew Show wouldn't really say what that was about, other than, of course, the fact that it's being hosted by a complete moron. So that would be the only thing that you would get out of the name, the Stephen Jondrew Show. But you might use Stephen Jondrew's Science Podcast. I still wouldn't use that because nobody knows who I am. But I'm just saying, an example, it would at least say what it's about. Now, you want to do some Google searches and look in Apple Podcasts, see if the name that you thought of is fresh or if it's been used. Because if it's been used, you're going to run into some other problems.
You should also get the domain name for whatever topic or theme or name of your podcast is. Now, we both will suggest this because of the numerous benefits that come with using your own domain name, otherwise known as the URL, the yourhobbypodcast.com. And you can redirect people to the same place. You have something that you have control of. It looks more professional. Now, when choosing the domain name, it should be easy for listeners to spell it. And most importantly, remember, the Stephen John Drew's super terrific faded podcast.com might not actually be so easy to remember, but podfade.com, yeah, that's a ton easier.
Also, you're going to want to get your creative package together. This is going to include things like your album art. Perhaps also you're going to have some audio components like intros and outros. And you're going to want to come up with that standard description of your podcast that you're going to put in a whole bunch of different places. So all of these creative elements, you got to get ahead of time. And we've talked about these in many, many other episodes. There's probably 149 of them.
Yeah, and of course, there's a whole bunch of other things to think about during the development of your show, such as what kind of format you want to have your show, what sort of co-host agreements do you want for your co-hosts or other people that are working on the show, what sort of legal requirement you might actually have. Specifically, if you're like a 501c3, you have to have that all figured out beforehand, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that you need to do before you actually get to the mechanics of recording and publishing your show. However, we'd be here for at least 150 hours or more if we went through all that. So we're going to tell you to go back, listen to our back catalog if you haven't already. And once you're ready to get your show started, let's get to the groundwork, Stephen. So we got a couple of ways that we can actually host our show. We have the media hosting and we have the self-hosting. I'm kind of more of the media hosting guy due to a lot of different reasons. And Stephen, he's adamant about self-hosting and has been for quite some time. So we're going to run down the differences starting right now.
So the way we've got this divided is into some different components, some different sections of the setup. And we're going to start off with the groundwork. I'll go ahead and let SP kick this one off just because, you know, let's be honest, everybody wants to hear him more than me.
Well, that's great, Stephen. I'm looking forward to actually starting this off. It's so gracious of you to let me start off this duel as we have it. And I'll start off with, of course, what I believe is my problem with web hosting. I don't want to run a website. I've tried a couple of times. It's a lot more time that I want to throw into it. It's a lot more specific. I mean, you have to worry about updating plugins. You have to worry about the security. You have to back it up. I don't want to worry about all that. I just want to create content and I want to podcast and upload it and I just want it done. So those are the reasons why I don't podcast through a website or self-hosting. But maybe you don't have the skills. Maybe you've grabbed a domain and you can start one later. You can always start one later. But if you don't want to run one or you don't have the skills, you can still podcast through a podcast media host. And if you choose to do that, you're going to have to choose which podcast media host to start with. And I have listed a bunch of criteria in a bunch of different places. And the two software podcast media hosts that services that I would recommend right now are Libsyn and Podbean. Yes, I look at others from time to time, but so far those are the only two that meet the criteria. So once you've chosen a podcast media host, sign up for that service and you get the ball running. Now, Stephen, there is an equal thing that you have to do if you're self-hosting.
Absolutely. If you are going to go ahead and do self-hosting, you're going to want to make sure that your web host that you choose will actually go ahead and allow you to host the media on it. Now, if you're running a website already, the best thing to do is just go ahead and email that provider because you want to check that out because some providers will not let you host media on there. But if you're not, you want to choose a web host. The one that I personally recommend is one called HawkHost. But if you are looking for something else, webhostingtalk.com is going to be a really good resource for you to find out what web hosts are good and which ones you want to stay away from. Me personally, I recommend staying away from the EIG brands. You can go ahead and Google them just because I've had some issues personally before with them, but that's just my opinion. Everybody is different. But again, you're picking a service just like you are with the media host.
Once you've signed up for your media host, one of the first things that you normally have to do is choose the name of your RSS. And this is important because some media hosts, it's difficult to change that RSS name down the road, and some you can, but it's really important to get this right out of the box. Whatever the name that you want, you might be stuck with it for quite some time. Now, you need to then familiarize yourself with the back end of your media host. This is where you're going to upload your episodes to. This are the fields that you are going to have to fill in once you've uploaded an episode to post it. I'm not saying actually go ahead and post it. Be familiar with these fields. Where to put in your RSS details. In Libsyn's, it's the RSS destination that you want to fill out. And where are the stats? If you're a stats hound, or if you think you're going to be, find out where those stats are and find out what they mean, because now's the time to kind of get to know it before you're in the hustle and bustle of producing week to week. And also plan to ask questions or watch tutorials on your specific media host to understand what you'll be filling out later. Because I'll tell you, the first time that I started my own feed, which was voicesdefiance.com, which was on Libsyn, I had no idea what half the fields were. So I took some time to try to get to know as much as I could before I started. Now, a lot of that stuff, other than the RSS feed, you could change later, so don't worry too much about it. But if you know just a little bit more about what you're actually typing into those fields, you can make less mistakes down the road. So it takes some time to get to know it's reading the instruction manual, basically, once you've chosen which instruction manual you want to follow.
On the self-hosting side of things, you're going to get there eventually, very similar to what SP said. But first, you got to get yourself something that you can do your podcast through. And so what I suggest you do is go into the backend panel of whatever web host provider that you've picked. Most of the time, it's something called cPanel. Sometimes it might be one called Plesk. In either case, they usually have a script installer that makes it really easy to install WordPress. And that would be the way that I would suggest you go if you are going to self-host your podcast, just because there's a lot of good support for it. Now, why I say to use the one-click installer, because it's so much easier than trying to manually install WordPress. Not as easy to do that. So use the one-click installer and get yourself set up there. Then you're going to go familiarize yourself just like SP did. So you want to look at the cPanel or Plesk, whatever it is. How are you going to upload files? Is it going to be through FTP? And you want to take a look and look behind the scenes at all of these areas. Now, one thing that you're going to want to also be prepared for is how you're going to get your podcast stats, should you want stats. So I'm going to suggest you register for PodTrack or blubrry. Those are services that will definitely allow you to track your stats, and you're going to want to look around those services as well and familiarize yourself there. Now, once you've actually got WordPress set up and you feel comfortable with that, you're going to want to install the plugin called PowerPress. There are several different podcast plugins available for WordPress. But honestly, if I'm going to make the suggestion, it would be for PowerPress because it is the most often updated. In fact, I've seen PowerPress roll out new podcast standard features before some of the main media hosts. So it just shows that they keep on top of things and keep this updated. Some of the other plugins have taken a while to get these new fields adopted, or they haven't at all. So I would say from an overall podcaster perspective, get PowerPress installed within WordPress. So that is my suggestions on the setup as far as self-hosting goes. And you want to just make sure that you get yourself familiarized as part of the groundwork. Now, the next section that we have here is actually setting up your podcast itself. So while you've got the groundwork laid and you might have entered a couple of things in here and there, you're going to want to make sure that you actually get things properly set up. And the way that I am going to start off the self-hosting side of things is you're going to want to create a category within WordPress for your show. There have been back and forth about whether you use the channel section of PowerPress or use the category, but from a overall web perspective, I'm suggesting that you use the category section because it's a lot easier to manage from a website perspective. Because remember, WordPress is more than just your podcast. It's a website. So I would suggest you make a category for your individual show. And once your category is all set up within WordPress, so like with this one, I would call it Better Podcasting, you're going to want to click on the quote, add podcasting button on that category. That's going to allow you to fill out all of the options for this that will eventually be pulled by all of the different podcasting services. So you're going to fill out show information as per the wizard that's there, or the tabs such as feed titles, description, whether it's explicit or not, language, copyright. Continue through this whole thing until your show information is all filled out for your podcast. What do you got on your side of the column there, SP?
You don't have to worry about setting up categories or channels, but you do have to worry about setting up your RSS feed. So like before I was saying, it's time to familiarize yourself with it. Once you've familiarized yourself with what goes into your RSS feed, it's time to actually put those details in. This will include a short summary of your show and then all the other details that go into it, like what category it is in iTunes. And then if you're planning on different destinations, publishing to different destinations, it's time to familiarize yourselves with those too. It's okay just to look at the RSS feed to start out with, because that will go to Apple Podcasts or iTunes through podcastconnect.com. And it will also go to several of the other destinations that are out there. With Libsyn specifically, some of the destinations can be actually set up individually. And this is a pro and a con with Libsyn. And some of the pros of setting up destinations through Libsyn is that it's auto-publishing to different destinations, kind of like what Spotify has been for the past 6-9 months, whereas it was very difficult for an independent up till this week to actually get in there. And Libsyn will manage those connections. So if there's something that changes in there, you don't have to worry about going in and changing whatever that is in your RSS feed so it will work there, or through whatever portal that they have. And then you can actually turn destinations on or off depending on where you want your show to show up. And I have done this before, because several of the destinations out there will actually suck up your file. So whatever you publish, when you publish the first time, it's going to be out there. And sometimes I've sent out an episode just because I wanted to publish on time, but I hadn't finished editing that yet. And I wanted the complete edited file to go out later. In some cases, I just wanted to send out a quick note to some people on some destinations. So that's the bonuses of using the Libsyn or any other podcast host destination or destination types, whatever the podcast media host calls it. Now, some cons for this is that Libsyn actually will end up controlling your feed. Say you want to move from Libsyn to Podbean, and you've set up your destination to Google Play Music, which I don't recommend doing anymore. But say you did that and you wanted that destination to be transferred over to Podbean. Unfortunately, Libsyn would control that specific. It's a separate RSS feed that you have set up. I thought it was like Google RSS or something. I forget the actual RSS title. It doesn't matter anymore. You don't want to send your stuff to Google Play Music, but it's that sort of stuff that they actually control your feed. And these factors would definitely make it more complicated to move from host to host. So familiarize yourself with the destinations or the separate publishing that is available for your podcast media host, because it could be very valuable to you in the future.
On the self-hosting side of things as well, you can definitely go ahead and set up destinations, but it's going to be more manual. If you actually head over into the PowerPress section of the plugin, there is a destinations tab, and it's got some great resources on how to submit yourself to places like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And then you can put the URL in there and they'll kind of work together, but you got to go through the individual process. So obviously with this, you're going to make sure you control it because you're setting the stuff up yourself. But the cons is that you got to go through and do it manually. So more work, but it's, again, you're going to have it yourself. So it's a trade-off there. Now, one thing I will note, I should mention this right now, and we might talk on this a little bit later, is there are some Spotify instructions. And as I wrote this doc, the Spotify instructions were wrong because of a change that we'll have in the download. So just wait. Now, when you are done with entering in the destinations, you might want to go ahead and set it up so that you can have social media auto publishing. There are plugins available within WordPress where you can have it auto tweet or auto Facebook post. You just got to go ahead and look, and generally that will be tied more to the whole WordPress installation rather than the podcast category itself. So a little bit different, though, on the media side of things for that, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say that unfortunately, most destinations actually require a episode to actually activate through. And so if you haven't published an episode 1 or episode 0, whatever you fall on there, you're likely not to actually be able to set up your destination. So that's why in this step, I'm saying familiarize yourself with the destinations that are possible. Unless you actually publish an episode, you can't really get into any other destination. And a lot of the social media connections are available, but you got to set those up. You got to make sure those accounts are linked. I know a few available are Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and social destinations like that are available. So you have to set up those links before you can auto-publish to them. And once you auto-publish, then you can promote those, you can retweet those, you can actually point back to them. And a lot of times in the different social medias, that if you auto-publish to, it will actually have a link or a player involved. Now, some social media like Facebook doesn't allow you to actually play audio these days, but you never know when that's going to be possible. So that's actually a valuable resource to have, is to set up those social media connections. So you should have at least 3, I believe, 3 places that you want to actually publish your podcast to, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, like I was talking about, YouTube. There are some media hosts that automatically publish to YouTube. We don't recommend the audio only with the static image on there, and that's from personal experience. It hasn't really worked out great for us, but if that's your thing, if that's what you want, you can actually set that up through some media hosts.
For sure. All right, this next category is when you're ready to actually post. That's right, we're talking about the posting process. And SP, I know you'll take this one here first, but before we get there, I just want to say that as we both went through and we made our notes in this section, we both quickly realized how similar it is between the two. So kick us off.
Remarkably similar. So first of all, you upload the file, and I will take a quick aside. Hopefully you've ID3 tagged it. And if you haven't yet, go back and listen to our previous episodes on ID3 tagging, and you'll be able to understand which ID3 tags that we actually recommend. Some media hosts actually have ID3 tags available to them. I personally like to do it outside of my media host because I like to change some of the ID3 tags as they go along and fill out some extra ones that the media hosts don't necessarily fill out. So either set that up ahead of time or ID3 tag your media ahead of time. But in either case, you're uploading that file. Once you upload the file, you're filling in all the post details. These are the different details that will go to the Apple ID3 tags. There's separate ones for Apple ID3. Your media host should have Apple Podcast ID3 tags available, or just your regular RSS episode tags, ID3 tags. That all gets in. The formatting for your post goes in at this point in time, and you can fill in your social media posts. And then if you have specific artwork for a specific episode, most media hosts allow you to do that. And then here's the most important thing that I'll end with here is you can select a post time. Now, the default in a lot of these podcast media hosts is right now. So you hit publish, it goes live. But say you want to wait till later that night, or you want to post at a specific time every week. There's a lot of reasons for that. You get everybody in a routine that, oh, the episode's available now. Also, if you post at the same time every week, if you're one of those people that are obsessed with stats. You can equate apples to apples, and you can say your first day did X amount of downloads on week 1, and week 2 it did X amount of downloads, and week 50 it did X amount of downloads, and week 150 it did X amount of downloads on the first day if you published at the same time every week. What I found with Libsyn is that it actually changes an hour when daylight savings time comes and hits in the United States. You got to pay attention to that. You might actually have to shift your time 1 hour left or right, depending on where you are, what time of year it is, and if you actually want the apples to apples comparison on one episode to another. But that's it. That's what you do. You upload the file, you fill in the details, you throw in that social media stuff. You might put in some episode specific artwork if that's your thing, and select the post time, or if it's just immediate, don't, and publish. That's what you do. And I think that's pretty much the same thing on the self-hosting side.
Yeah, totally. There's a couple of quick notes that I'll say just to get you going on your best foot. Number one, upload this to your host. Now, I have a tip for this. I would suggest that where you keep these files are all within one folder. You're going to want to make sure that they're easy to find and that they're not being jumbled in with all of your other web files, because you're going to have a lot of them. So create a folder. And I would say that if you can do a subdomain for this specifically, and the reason why is from a technical perspective, you can actually split that off. So if one day you wanted to be able to take, like, let's say podcast.betterpodcasting.com and have that point differently to than where betterpodcasting.com is, you can actually do that. So from a future proofing perspective, if you can put it on a separate subdomain, but at the least a folder, then you're going to go and create a post like SP did with his side of things. But this is within WordPress for the self-hosting. And remember, this is, again, going to go on your website. So you want to write the post in a manner that's largely being tailored towards your website, but keeping in mind that there are going to be some things that go into your feed, like the title. So you can go add tags as you want. And once you've formatted this post based off your website, scroll down a little bit and you'll see all of the specific podcast section and the fields that are there within PowerPress. So you'll enter the URL for your file. You'll complete the different areas like the iTunes subtitle, the iTunes summary, and the iTunes explicit box, which is all just the tags for that show. So iTunes and other podcatchers know the subtitle, the summary, and whether or not the episode's explicit. Of course, fill out any social media boxes that you might want to. But one thing that I want to highlight with the self-hosting side of things is within an RSS feed, there's actually two main description fields for an episode. The first is what's called the description tag. The other is the iTunes summary tag. Most media hosts have simplified this process so they're one and the same, but actually they do vary a little bit depending on what is pulling your podcast. Like Apple generally for each episode looks at the iTunes summary. However, there are some other platforms that look at that, quote, description tag. Within WordPress, they are two different fields. So if you want, you can actually make the iTunes summary tag a little bit shorter because Apple Podcasts generally wants to see that shorter. And you can make the excerpt box the one that other non-Apple podcatchers will maybe pull, because it really depends on a variety of circumstances. So you can actually have two different you can use these in two different manners. As well, you can have your main post completely interactive with links and all sorts of other weird things if you want your website to be a little bit different. So you can really just customize all three of those elements independently, should you wish to, or you can just keep it short and simple and just copy and paste them through all three. And then once you're ready to publish, you publish or schedule to publish as you see fit, because you can schedule just like you can in media hosting. So again, very similar between the two.
Fun fact, both Stephen and I have published on self-hosting, because I've done it for Gonna Geek before when Stephen was out on vacation, and on our media hosts. You know, Stephen usually posts Better Podcasting. I've definitely posted Better Podcasting on a few weeks that Stephen hasn't been able to get to it on time. And of course, all my shows are on media hosts. So we have both published on both media host and self-hosting.
That's actually a really good point. Really good point. All right, so we have some miscellaneous notes here that we want to mention when you are considering either media hosting or self-hosting. I'll go ahead and kick it off, and I'm going to go ahead and probably make a few self-hosters mad. That's right. I said I'm going to make some self-hosters mad, not media hosters, self-hosters. Let's be totally real. While I think there's really good, valid reasons for keeping your RSS feed on your own domain, many of which I will argue to the end of the earth with people when they say something that I disagree with, the reality is keeping your media on your self-hosting is generally because you're cheap. Like, let's be real. If you are going to be keeping your media files themselves on your hosting, it's because you're trying to save money. Now, I want to highlight right now that you can still self-host your RSS feed because, again, I think there's a plethora of really good reasons to self-host your RSS feed, but keep your media on a media host. This is possible, and I will probably be switching over to this model when my self-hosting that I have my media on, which is, by the way, different than my main primary websites. When that expires, I'm probably going to go and move that media over to a dedicated media host because there's a variety of inexpensive media hosts available now that weren't available a few years ago when I did my last shuffle with all of my files. And they offer decent stats built right in, so I wouldn't need Blubrry or PodTrack or anything like that. They're meant to be a media host. And as long as I'm prepared that one of these might end up going away and I keep a backup and everything, and I'm prepared to maybe move that over and reevaluate later, there's really not a lot of risk. So it's almost better that I don't worry about, well, will my web host all of a sudden say I can't put my MP3s on there, or is it okay? Is it drawing too much? And just go with a media host for my files and keep my RSS feed on my domain under my own web host in my own property. So that's sort of something I wanted to highlight as a caveat to all of this. I obviously wanted to walk through the individual hosting of your file itself on your actual web hosting because that was the whole goal of self-hosting, but I just don't know that it makes that much sense anymore.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you can actually host your files anywhere as long as you have control of that RSS feed. I also wanted to bring up, hey, if you run into trouble with your media host, we've talked about this before on the show. Contact your podcast media host company first. Running to Facebook or Reddit or wherever forum that you're on might not yield the best answer. Things change all the time in the podcast space. Heck, look in the last 6 months. So I wrote a post on Reddit in March about where to post your podcast to. And since that time, since March, it's September now. So September is the 9th month of the year. March is the 3rd month of the year. That's 6 months. There have been 2 major changes in the pod space. Google Podcasts became a thing shortly after I wrote that post, and now Spotify has changed that you can submit as an independent. We'll talk about that later, as Stephen alluded to. So that is the last 6 months. Think of what the next 6 months are going to bring. So your podcast media host changes or should be changing to adapt to those changes. And the best way to get the answers to that is to contact your podcast media host, not you know who or who knows who out there in social media land. So there's just another little tip there. And there will always be a list of podcast media hosts that we do not recommend. And this changes over time too. Pay attention and stay off of those at the time that we say it. So like for now, we're saying SoundCloud's bad, Anchor's bad. Don't put your RSS feed in Anchor. And there are some that are on our watch list. We talked about them before. Simplecast, Pinecast. We're really pulling for those guys to jump into the big boys pool in terms of podcast media hosting. There's a couple things with both of those that we just can't recommend yet, but we're really watching them and we really want those to change. And Stephen, you will agree with this. I know you will agree with this. Back up your files. Don't trust it either to your media host or your web host. Make sure you have local copies. Make sure you back them up. You use an online backup service. Make sure you do that, a USB backup drive. maybe all of the above, but make sure you're backing up your files because something can happen. If they're only in one spot, something could happen to them and then you've lost your files and then you're looking to your listeners to save you. And yes, I've saved some shows because I've downloaded those files to my computer. So those are some things. I've got some more. Steven, do you have some more though?
Yeah, the backup thing is one of the caveats that I had with self-hosting. I talked about making sure that you keep your files all together, but I would suggest that you get in the routine when, as soon as you are running a website, make sure that you are routinely using the whole backup wizard to back up the whole space. Get in the routine of that, even if it's once a week or once every other week. At least you know you've got it from a couple weeks ago. Often there's a backup wizard within cPanel or Plesk. Just a really good idea to do that. And then you can always restore that to another company that uses the same panel, so Plesk or cPanel. So definitely get in the habit of backing up. And the other two things that I had was just more of actually a web perspective is, number one, I suggest installing Manage WP. It's a great plugin that will allow you to back up. I think it's once a month for free, but has some other good options in there for keeping things up to date and whatnot. And also make sure you get a caching plugin. The one that I like right now is called Lightspeed Cache. It's LITESPEED cache, but there's other ones like WP Super Cache. There's a whole bunch out there. So install a caching plugin because it's going to help keep the resources down on your web space. There's a lot of people that are offering web hosting that's geared towards WordPress. One of the things that many of them do is really utilize caching plugins to help make sure that it's snappy, and it really just keeps the resources down.
A couple parting shots. Always choose a media host if you're going to media host that you can leave if you want to, and never choose a media host that will own your content. And I'm going to shock you going out just like Steven shocked you going in. And I will say, if you want to know more about self-hosting your RSS feed, listen to Better Podcasting episode number 65. We go through all the tips, all the tricks that you want to know about self-hosting on that. And I highly recommend that you check that episode out if you are even thinking about self-hosting.
Awesome. So no matter who you are, what podcaster you are, make sure you do what you feel's right for yourself. Don't take blanket advice. Make your own decision. Everybody is different. And we hope today these two setup paths can show you how they're similar but different. So tell us, how exactly do you host your podcast? What do you do to streamline your workflow? What are the things that you're yelling right now at your phone or iPod or whatever, saying, you guys are making it long? Let us know through any of the ways. You can definitely tweet us at BetterPod. You can head on over to facebook.com/betterpodcasting or head on over to betterpodcasting.com. But let's go ahead and move on to the Better Podcasting download.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
I thought I scooped Steven. I was so hyped this week. I was like, oh, wow, look, boom, Spotify. You can now submit your show to Spotify. Congratulations, Steven, because, of course, GonnaGeek.com show was independent and he hadn't made its way onto Spotify yet. However, within seconds of me sending that, he must have been up in the middle of the night going to the bathroom. He must be becoming an old man because he immediately took a screenshot on his phone and sent it to me and said, oh, by the way, it's already there 6 hours ago. And boom, he took a screenshot of our Facebook page, which I don't have access to. And he said, I posted this 6 hours ago. So he was all full of himself and gloating. So because he scooped me, I'm going to turn it over to the miraculous Steven, and he's going to tell you all about the new way to submit your show to Spotify.
All right, let's caveat this and say that first off, the podcaster portal or whatever you want to call it is in beta. So it is pretty basic, but it is in beta. So you should know that. That might mean that there's glitches and whatnot. But yeah, this came out this week. All of a sudden, people were getting emails. For some reason, even though I've submitted my show twice, I didn't get the email, but other people did. So immediately, of course, I ended up going on there and submitting the GonnaGeek.com show like SP said. But before we kind of talk about my experience, I want to talk a little bit more about the portal itself. In here, it's very similar to Apple Podcast Connect, where you can submit your show, you can track show metrics, and you can take a look at some different things about your show from the Spotify perspective. Now, as a hobby podcaster, what you need to know is that up until now, most of the podcasts on Spotify were submitted from a media host like Libsyn or Podbean or Pinecast. And there's been a couple of ways that these hosts have been able to get your podcast in there. For self-hosters like myself, generally there was a manual form that you had to fill out and submit, and more often than not, you never heard back, like myself. So the good news is that yes, as a self-hoster, you can definitely go in there. I actually found this about 11:30 at night, my time, as I was about to go to bed, and I'm like, nope, not going to bed, gonna submit the GonnaGeek.com show, and I did. And I woke up the next morning, like 4 or 5 hours later. That's right, I don't get much sleep. And it was already on there. So definitely it is fast. A lot of people who have been submitting their show through media hosts like Libsyn have been saying that it's fast. I'll be honest, when I submitted, I thought there was going to be a manual process. I was worried because when you fill out the submission box, it lists a whole bunch of media hosts and it says, where's your file or your podcast hosted it? And then the last one is other/I don't know. So I had to select the other/I don't know. I'm like, oh, this is totally going to a reject pile somewhere. But no, it was quick. And a lot of people on Facebook and other groups are saying that it has been fast for them. Some people have been saying within an hour. Some have been saying a few hours. So it's looking like the gates are open for us self-hosters. Now, from a dashboard perspective, things are pretty basic where you'll see your show information and episode information, but there are some stats details in there. And I just want to quickly run through some of the stats details that are available. There's an episodes tab, and that shows your starts, your streams, your listens, as well as your publish date of each episode. There's an audience tab that says the starts and streams with a graph. It will tell you the gender, the age, and the country origin of the audience. Now remember, Spotify, you're playing through an account. So in theory, they should be able to get some of these metrics. Now, there are some ways that you can filter, and I've showed SP how you can filter these by, and I know he's a stats junkie, and he's itching right now. You can see him scratching if you're watching the video side of things. He's like, I gotta talk about stats. SP, how can you filter these?
You can filter these stats. These are the Spotify stats through the Spotify portal in the last 7 days, the last 14 days, the last week or 2 weeks, the last 30 days, roughly a month, the last 90 days, which is a quarter, which would be good for those business podcasts that report stats quarterly. And you can do the last calendar month. You could do all time, so you can get those big, huge numbers. And then you can do a custom date range. So if you just want to know something like, I know, Stephen, we've run into issues where people have hacked into our RSS feeds before. And if you'd want to know the specific dates of that, you could fiddle around with the custom dates in there. Or if you have a special event running or something like that, you'd want, or like a promotion, you'd want to know what your bonus is during those custom date ranges. So those are some pretty neat things to filter on. And this is pretty neat that Spotify is allowing users, podcasters, to be able to see those stats. I think Spotify is actually leaning forward quite a bit with the podcast community.
All right, so here's the question of the hour by podcasters who are currently in Spotify. What do I do if I'm already in there and I was submitted by my media host? Well, to that, the answer is very simple. It means too bad, so sad. Didn't you learn from all of those podcast consultants that said you shouldn't choose host A, B, and C because they're automatically submitting your podcast to Apple Podcasts, so then they own your show within Apple Podcasts. So if you ever want to get the podcast in your portal, it's not going to happen because they own it. Didn't you learn from that already and realize that the same darn thing was happening when all of these people were submitting to Spotify? Okay, I'm joking. The truth
Well,
is...
there's some truth to that, okay? Now, fortunately, since I host on Libsyn, I can tell you my experience on Libsyn is that there is stats available through Libsyn, but they're delayed a couple of days, so you're not getting them right, and you probably won't get the age and that sort of stuff. I don't think there's any stats API. They're just letting you have the raw numbers. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a hit by doing it. But I will say the 6 or 9 months that I was able to be in Spotify that GetAGeek.com show were kind of nice.
That's fair. Absolutely fair. But all smugness kidding aside, the reality that I'm going to say is just wait. Don't submit your show again. It could be duplicated. If we look at Spotify's track record, they've done a pretty good job of trying to actually pay attention to what the podcast market wants. And if you look at how they started with a relationship with Libsyn and Rob Walsh at Libsyn. And Rob's done a really good job of representing the podcast community. And when things do come up, he tries to get an answer. So honestly, I say wait, because I'm sure they still have that relationship. And if all of a sudden Libsyn's getting a bunch of people saying, well, oh, hey, I want to get this in my portal in Spotify, I got confidence that Rob and the team over at Libsyn are going to do that. And honestly, I think that was the right way for Spotify to start, was with media hosts, because it was reliable. It was a good way to have a level of control over things. And I think that Spotify wouldn't be at the way that it is right now and the level it is right now with podcasts if they didn't do those moves. So just wait, because they've shown that they have those relationships and they're looking out for the podcasters. And so I suspect that somehow this is going to happen and there's going to be a conversion process. I don't know anything, but I'm sure there must be a way that will come on how to claim it eventually. I don't know what's going to happen right away. Even if every single media host person said, hey, we got to get this answer, Spotify might put it to the bottom of their list. But in any case, there's some really good representatives out there looking out for you right now. So I say just wait. I'm sure someone will get something at some point to tell you.
As a note of caution, I would take a look at this process, see how long this process took, because if the same thing happens with maybe Pandora, you want to be on Pandora because it's got a lot more listeners on there than Spotify. And you might want to wait until they open up their portal to everybody, or you might want to submit through your media host. It's up to you, but you're going to have to make those choices as we go forward. Now, one of the reasons why that we were told anyway that Spotify used media host is because they wanted to be able to knock down content. They're really worried about streaming music that was already copyrighted and then they'd have to pay royalties. They were really worried about that. And I think for them that they made the smart move and they went through a media host, which could enact a takedown versus them having to do the takedown themselves. So we'll see. Maybe they got lax over it because they saw that there wasn't that many takedowns, but maybe there wasn't that many takedowns because those takedowns might have already happened. I don't know. So this will be interesting to watch. Keep watching it. Keep listening to us on Better Podcasting. We'll give you the big news points as they occur. And if the same things happen with Pandora, as I was talking about, you want to make sure that you have your informed decision.
Absolutely. Now, before we get out of the download, I just had a really quick unrelated thing that I want to mention. In the past, we've talked about how Skype 7, the older version of Skype that a lot of people have used, is reaching the end of life. A lot of podcasters have used this and have been a little reluctant to move to Skype 8 because of some bugs. Well, originally, Microsoft said that the end of life was going to be, I believe, September for Skype 7. Then they said, okay, maybe we were a little too ambitious. Well, today, many of us received an email that said, we saw that you recently used Skype version 7. If you've already updated to Skype 8, please ignore this. And then the message went on to say that it looks like November 1st is going to be the end for Skype 7. And November 15th will be the end of Skype 7 for mobile and tablets. So know that at this time, it looks like if you're using Skype 7, you've only got till November or until they push it off again. Who knows?
I got really nervous because I thought I was running the updated version of Skype. Turns out I did, by the way, but it's really hard to get the version number in the new Skype because it's not configured like any other program. I'm on version 8.30, I think, is the one that I'm on right now, but I did check it because I got the same notification. It said, you recently logged in. What? No, I haven't. I've been using the new one of Skype ever since it came out. So just make sure you're on Skype 8, and if you're not, you might want to download it because it's coming really soon.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to the Better Podback.
Got a lot of great tweets this week. First of all, this was something that was instigated by me. I was watching the Blubrry podcast account, and they had a tweet on September 20th. Said Blubrry podcast directory tops 600,000 shows, make it one of the largest independent sources. And I got really curious about this because we've heard that Apple has about 550,000 shows into it. And we've also heard stats that we've talked about before on Better Podcasting that says that not all of those are active shows. So I tweeted back and said, well, wait a minute, how many have released a new episode in the past 90 days? And Blubrry hemmed and hawed a little bit, but they actually got back to me and they said the last we reported this at Podcast Movement, the number was 109,000. So I asked to clarify. I said, just to clarify, 109,000 out of the 600,000 plus podcasts in the Blubrry podcast directory as of Podcast Movement 2018 had released an episode in the previous 90 days. And they said, yep, with 2 Ps. So this just goes to show you that there might be a lot of podcasts that are out there, but maybe not a lot of active shows out there. So if you're hesitant about getting into the space, you might want to get into the space. And also, this goes to show you that if you do content that's evergreen and you do it in seasons or you just put it out there, that it's still out there years later in some cases. And so that's the benefit and the power of podcasting. Stephen, we also had a tweet from our pal at Cybercast, didn't we?
Yes. Cybercast said, can you guys suggest ground loop isolators and where to put them in your chain? I have one, but it's not doing a thing. My laptop has a real bad connection to the mixer for some reason, and I can't kill the hum other than noise reduction in Audacity. Now, for those of you who are watching the video side of things, SP is actually holding up a ground loop isolator. Now, I mentioned this last week that there's a couple different ways that you can use ground loop isolators. There's the more traditional sense, which are 3.5 millimeter boxes, because many times these ground loop isolators were originally used for in cars where there was aftermarket stereos and you would get hums. So that's sort of where they originated. But you can also get ones that are just a regular 3.5 millimeter male to male, or female to female, I should say. So then you can use a male to male connection or, whatever you need. So a 3.5 millimeter male into a TRS or whatever you need. And those are the ones that SP and I have been using. Now, the thing is, they're not going to fix all problems. If there is a ground loop, they're going to fix that. But sometimes there can be interference by other things. My personal suggestion is, if you go to the video side of things at betterpodcasting.com/150, SP is holding one up. There are many that are clearly the same product, but branded differently. I've actually got one, as you can hear, still in package. It looks exactly the same, but the company on mine is HAVIC. So I guess that's Havoc. And it looks exactly the same as the one that SP has, which is by what brand?
This brand that I have in my hand is Xiocom, but I'm actually using a brand called MPOW in my setup right now that's actually broadcasting to Twitter through Periscope.
And if those don't work, last ditch effort, you can go ahead and look up the ones that are actually bigger boxes, and they generally go into an RCA connection. Those might be a little bit better, or maybe a DI box where it's got the ground lift on it. That might
DI stands for direct injection.
Yes, very, very good point. And so that might help you as well. But if none of these things do, then you've probably got another problem. But honestly, ground loop isolators have worked for me when I've had an actual ground problem. And as for where to place them, I suggest putting them right by the device that you're wanting to record at. That's what I find. So like I like to have them near my my input on my computer if that is where I'm having the problem. So sometimes I get a whine going from my L12 into the sound card microphone input. I like to take that ground loop isolator and put it right by my computer so that it is sort of at the end of the chain.
So good luck with your ground loop issue, Cybercast. I know it's not always easy to do. One thing that you might want to check is just unplug that laptop and see if you still get it. And if you do, it's probably not your laptop power or ground loop. It might be something else in your setup. We also got a tweet from @Podcastage, and @Podcastage, which is run by Bandrew Scott, our friend over at bandrewscott.com. He says, damn, Papa Pioneer, aka Moneybags, laid down the law regarding starting a podcast with expectations to make a lot of money. Amazing. He's referring to my download last week where I was talking about having the right expectations to start a podcast, which we talked about before, by the way, on Better Podcasting episode 82. And he really enjoyed that segment. I'm not against starting a podcast to make money, but I'm against starting a podcast to make money right away, because unless you've got a mailing list of hundreds of thousands of people, it just ain't going to happen. You're going to frustrate everybody in the process. You're going to give podcasting a bad name. So don't do it unless you have the right circumstances, or if you do it, have the expectations it's going to take you a little bit to make the money.
Also, in relation to last week's episode, we had @DXVeris say, now that is what I call service. People really do win at Better Pod, and that's because last week's theme was spurred by DXVeris's post. Now, a couple weeks ago, you might have heard of the #verified Cody Goff. That's right. He was on the show on episode 148, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com/148 to talk about podcast promos. Now, what I want to say now is he's the award-winning verified Cody Goff. That's right. We also wanted to give a special shout out to Cody Goff for winning a podcast award this past weekend. Congratulations, Cody. You are now a podcast award winner. And we like to think that it was the good luck of coming on our show. And honestly, Cody responded to one of our congratulatory posts, and he said, thank you so much. Literally still freaking out. Could never have done this without the support of @BetterPod and @GonnaGeek. You guys are the real podcast MVPs. Happy #International Podcast Day. So basically what he's saying is that we're the award-winning podcasters. I think that that's the only way you can take that.
I definitely will take all the credit for him winning the award. Thus, he needs to provide us with some compensation for the award or the award itself.
Yeah, and I'm not paying for it, by the way. I'm not chipping in. You can pay for it yourself and then ship it to us. Okay, I'm not paying for it.
You're paying for shipping too, Cody.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to go ahead and share a personal Stephen John Drew story here, and it's not that type of personal story. Don't you worry. Just this past week, while I was exploring XSplit and the way that there's some different options in there to capture a new video card that I've got, I discovered that there's a setting in the different sources so that, like, you know, when I put my camera on screen and everything, there's a different option called full dynamic range. And I've had this enabled from the beginning, or since the option came in, because I think I was using XSplit when it came in, and it actually affected the darks on my screen. So like if I was wearing a black shirt or I had a darker area, it went super ultra black. I think it's meant for things like gaming and whatnot, where you want to just capture those blacks very authentically. But from a actual practical, this is a camera looking at me, it's caused me a ton of problems as far as brightness goes. Anytime I wore anything dark, I had light above me, I had lights in front of me, I could not get it right. So turning this off ended up getting things to look more normal, how I actually see them with my own eyes. And I wanted to mention this for two reasons. Number one, if you've been having the problem yourself, go look for that under the source. But number two, just to say, we've been doing this for 150 episodes. I think I did 20 Gonna Geek shows video before we started the show, maybe a little less. And I just discovered an option today. So you never know when you're going to discover something new, and don't be afraid when it happens. Look at it, explore it, turn it off, turn it back on, take a look. and be okay with the fact that you might have missed it. It happens. You can't know everything about everything. And so I just wanted to share that story on episode 150 that Steven screwed up. There you go.
Chris and I from the GonnaGeek.com show will tell you that every time before we start to go live, Steven's always saying, my color's not right. What and he's been fooling with lights. He's been doing everything for 3 years. 3 years. And he finally found the setting to make it go good. So yeah, podcasting, you learn something new all the time. And thank you for finally figuring that out, because now we won't have to spend a half an hour of you combing your hair into your camera before we start our podcast every week.
Nope. Gonna comb my hair every time. That's just part of me.
Go drink some maple syrup, Canadian.
Well, there you go. That is going to take us to the end of the show. So for episode 150 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drew saying for 150 episodes, I've prepped, recorded, edited, published, and then I've repeated.
And I'm SP saying, yeah, I've done some of that, but Steven's the workhorse, and I just want to thank our listeners. Thank you so much for listening and downloading our show. We'll see you guys next week. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.
How I saved my podcast story. Steve, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you got to find that balance between I swear I've been doing this for 150 episodes. Time it's something called cPanel. Sometimes it might be called words are hard.
It's the same thing on the self-hosting side.
Yeah, totally. There's a couple of quick notes that I'll say just to get you going on your best foot. Number one, again, upload to your again, upload to your media host. You're going to want to go ahead and make sure I said media host. I swear I'm the same Steven over the last 50 or 150. Or am I? I'm an alien. Ooh, let's go into conspiracy corner. This is conspiracy corner. Oh, let's get out of here. Really creepy.
Where was the change in the screen? The green, the night vision.
Fair.